Chapter 3. Washing Up. Now, Stuart was an early riser. He was almost always the first person up in the morning. He liked the feeling of being the first one stirring. He enjoyed the quiet rooms with the books standing still on the shelves, the pale light coming in through the windows, and the fresh smell of day. In winter-time, it would be quite dark when he climbed from his bed made out of a cigarette box, and he sometimes shivered with cold as he stood in his nightgown doing his exercises. Stuart touched his toes 10 times each morning to keep himself in good condition. He'd seen his brother George do it, and George had explained that it kept the stomach muscles firm and was a fine abdominal thing to do. After exercising, Stuart would slip in his handsome wool wrapper, tie the cord tightly around his waist, and start for the bathroom, creeping silently through the long, dark hall, past his mother's and father's room, past the hall closet where the carpet sweeper was kept, past George's room, and along by the head of the stairs till he got to the bathroom. Of course, the bathroom would be dark too, but Stuart's father had thoughtfully tied a long string to a pull chain of the light. The string reached clear to the floor. By grasping it as high up as he could and throwing his whole weight into it, Stuart was able to turn on the light. Swinging on the string this way, with his long bathrobe trailing around his ankles, he looked like a little old friar pulling the bell rope on an abbey. To get to the wash basin, Stuart had to climb a tiny rope ladder which his father had fixed for him. George had promised to build Stuart a small special wash basin only 1 inch high, and with a little rubber tube through which the water could flow, but George was always saying that he was going to build something and then forgetting about it. Stuart had just went ahead and climbed the rope ladder to the family wash basin every morning to wash his face and hands and brush his teeth. Mrs. Little had provided him a doll-sized toothbrush, a doll-sized cake of soap, a doll-sized washcloth, and a doll's comb, which he had used for combing his whiskers. He carried these things in his bathrobe pocket, and when he reached the top of the ladder, he took them out, laid them neatly in a row, and set about the task of turning the water on. For such a small fellow, turning the water on was quite a problem. He had discussed it with his father one day after making several unsuccessful attempts. "See, I can get up to the faucet all right," he explained, "but I can't seem to turn it on because, I have nothing to brace my feet against." "Yes, I know," his father replied. "That's the whole trouble." George, who always listened to conversations whenever he could, said that in his opinion they ought to construct a brace for Stuart, and with that he got out some boards, a saw, a hammer, a screwdriver, a bradawl, and some nails, and started to make a terrific fuss in the bathroom, building what he said was going to be a brace for Stuart. But he soon became interested in something else and disappeared, leaving the tools lying around all over the bathroom floor. Well, Stuart, after examining this mess, turned to his father again. "Maybe I could pound the faucet with something and turn it that way," he said. So Stuart's father provided him with a very small, light hammer made of wood, and Stuart found that by swinging it 3 times around his head and letting it come down with a crash against the handle of the faucet, he could start a thin stream of water flowing, enough to brush his teeth in anyway, and moisten his washcloth. So every morning after climbing to the basin, he would seize his hammer, pound the faucet, and the other members of the household, dozing in their beds, would hear the bright, sharp plink, plink, plink of Stuart's hammer, like a faraway blacksmith telling him that the day had come and that Stuart was trying to brush his teeth. Chapter 4. Exercise. One fine morning in the month of May, when Stuart was 3 years old, he arose early, as was his custom, washed and dressed himself, took his hat and cane, and went downstairs into the living room to see what was doing. Nobody was around but Snowbell, the white cat belonging to Mrs. Little. Snowbell was another early riser, and this morning she was lying on the rug in the middle of the room, thinking about the days when she was just a wee kitten. "Good morning," said Stuart. "Hello," replied Snowbell sharply. "You're up early, aren't you?" Stuart looked at his watch. "Yes," he said. "It's only 5 minutes past 6, but I felt good, and I thought I'd come down and get a little exercise." "I should think you'd get all the exercise you want up there in the bathroom, banging around, waking up the rest of us, trying to get that water started, so that you can brush your teeth. Your teeth aren't really big enough to brush anyway, are they? Want to see a good set? Now look at mine." Snowbell opened his mouth and showed 2 rows of gleaming white teeth, sharp as needles. "Very nice," said Stuart, "but mine are all right, too, even though they're small. As for exercise, I take all I can get. I bet my stomach muscles are firmer than yours." "I bet they're not," said the cat. "I bet they are," said Stuart. "They're like iron bands." "I bet they're not," said the cat. Stuart glanced around the room to see what he could do to prove to Snowbell that good stomach muscles he had. He spied the drawn window shade on the east window, and its shade cord and ring like a trapeze, and it gave him such a good idea. Climbing to the window sill, he took off his hat, laid down his cane. "Bet you can't do this," he said to the cat, and he ran and he jumped onto the ring, the way acrobats do in the circus, meaning to pull himself up. Well, a surprising thing happened. Stuart had taken such a hard jump that it started the shade, and with a loud snap the shade flew up clear to the top of the window, dragging Stuart along with it and rolling him up inside so that he couldn't budge. "Holy mackerel!" said Snowbell, who was just almost as surprised as Stuart Little. "I guess that'll teach him to show off his muscles." "Help! Let me out!" cried Stuart, who was frightened and bruised inside the rolled-up shade, and who could hardly breathe. But his voice was so weak that nobody heard. Snowbell just chuckled. He was not fond of Stuart, and it didn't bother him at all that Stuart was all wrapped up in the window shade, crying and hurt and unable to get out. Instead of running upstairs and telling Mr. and Mrs. Little about the accident, Snowbell did a very curious thing. He glanced around to see if anyone was looking, and then he leapt softly to the window-sill, picking up Stuart's hat and his cane in his mouth, carried them to the pantry, and laid them down at the entrance to the mouse-hole. When Mrs. Little came down later and found them there, she gave a shrill scream which brought everybody on the run. "It's happened!" she cried. "What has?" asked her husband. "Stuart's gone down the mouse-hole." Chapter 5. Rescued. George was in favor of ripping up the pantry floor. He had gone and gotten his hammer, his screwdriver, and an ice pick. "I'll have this old floor up in a double-quick time," he said, inserting his screwdriver onto the edge of the first board and giving it a good vigorous pry. "We will not rip up the floor till we've had a good search," announced Mr. Little. "That's final, George. You can put that hammer away where you got it." "All right," said George. "I see that nobody in this house cares about anything about Stuart but me." Mrs. Little began to cry. "My poor dear little son," she said. "I know he'll just get wedged somewhere." "Just because you can't travel comfortably in a mouse hole doesn't mean it isn't a perfectly suitable place for Stuart," said Mr. Little. "Just don't get yourself all worked up, dear." "Maybe we ought to lower some food in," suggested George. "That's what the state police did when a man got stuck in a cave." George darted into the kitchen and came running back with a dish of applesauce. "We can pour some of this in. It will run down where he is." George spooned out a bit of applesauce and started to poke it in the hole. "Stop that!" bellowed Mr. Little. "George, will you kindly let me handle this situation? Put that applesauce away immediately." Mr. Little glared fiercely at George. "I was trying to help my own brother," said George, shaking his head as he carried the sauce back to the kitchen. "Let's all call to Stuart," suggested Mrs. Little. "It was quite possible that the mouse-hole branches twists and about, and that he has lost his way." "Well, said Mr. Little, "I will count 3, and then we will all call, and then we will all keep perfectly quiet for 3 seconds, listening then for the answer." He took out his watch. Mr. and Mrs. Little and George got down on their hands and knees and put their mouths as close as possible to the mouse hole. Then they all called, "Stuart!" And then they all kept perfectly still for 3 seconds. Stuart, from his cramped position inside the rolled-up shade, heard them yelling in the pantry and called back, "Here I am!" But he had such a weak voice and was so far inside the shade that the other members of the family did not hear his answering cry. "Again," said Mr. Little. 1, 2, 3. "Stuart!" It was no use. No answer was heard. Mrs. Little went up to her bedroom, lay down, and sobbed. Mr. Little went to the telephone and called up the Bureau of Missing Persons, but when the man asked for a description of Stuart and was told that he was about 2 inches high, he hung up in disgust. George, meantime, went down cellar and hunted around to see if he could find another entrance to the mouse hole. He moved a great many trunks, suitcases, flower pots, baskets, boxes, and broken chairs from one end of the cellar to the other in order to get to the section of the wall which he thought was likeliest, but found no hole. He did, however, come across an old discarded rowing machine of Mr. Little's, and becoming interested in this, carried it upstairs with some difficulty and spent the rest of the morning rowing. When lunchtime came, everyone had forgotten about breakfast. All three sat down to a lamb stew which Mrs. Little had prepared, but it was a sad meal, each one trying not to stare at the empty little chair which Stuart has always occupied right next to Mrs. Little's glass of water. No one could eat. So great was the sorrow. George ate a bit of dessert, but nothing else. When lunch was over, Mrs. Little broke out crying again and said she thought Stuart must be dead. "Nonsense, nonsense," growled Mr. Little. "If he is dead," said George, "we ought to pull down the shades all through the house." And he raced to the windows and began pulling down the shades. "George!" shouted Mr. Little in an exasperated tone. "If you don't stop acting in this idiotic fashion, I will have to punish you. We're having enough trouble today without having to cope with your foolishness." But George had already run into the living room and begun to darken it to show his respect for the dead. He pulled a cord, and out dropped Stuart onto the window-sill. "Well, for the love of Pete," said George, Look who's here, Mom." "It's about time somebody pulled down that shade," remarked Stuart. "That's all I can say." He was quite weak and hungry. Mrs. Little was so overjoyed to see him that she kept right on crying. Of course, everybody wanted to know how it had happened. "Well, it was simply an accident that might happen to anybody," said Stuart. "As for my hat and my cane being found at the entrance of the mouse hole, you can draw your own conclusions."